This is the 1081 Unit 10 Extra Credit Test Review. And this particular review uses the various lessons that we had in Unit 10 over World War I, Russian Revolution, Great Depression, rise of fascism, World War II, as resources to study for the test. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down the list on these questions. It's got the various lessons, the slides, or the screen recordings that these questions came from. And I'm going to discuss the answers. You can use these to fill this in, get extra credit for your test and study. So the first thing we have is this chart right here, and it shows the event, political impact, economic impact, social impact, which has the economic impact as blank. So what is that? What would go in there? Well, think about what is the economic impact of World War I. We're talking about $338 billion in destruction. Whole treasuries of countries emptied, depleted. Countries having to take out massive loans from the United States to rebuild. So what are some positives of the alliance system? The alliance system is one of the underlying causes that we've identified for World War I in general. And we're going to define those later on. But one positive about the alliance system is that it can protect your country from being attacked. If you have a lot of friends, your adversaries are not going to want to attack you. But there's a negative side to the alliance system as we bring this down a little bit, bring this one up. And that negative is that your alliance that you belong to can pull your country into a war that you didn't start. And like I said, that is one of the underlying causes of World War I. So what are some causes that did lead to World War I? Think mania, or you can think Maine, but I like mania simply because then we get the assassination put into it. Mania stands for militarism, alliance system, nationalism, imperialism, and the spark that set the whole thing off, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so what type of warfare was most common in World War I? That's easy. Trench warfare. We talked about that quite a bit. It's unique to World War I as far as being involved in a stalemate that lasted well over 3 years. And so what new technologies emerged during World War I? And keep in mind, a lot of these new technologies were efforts to somehow overcome that stalemate of trench warfare. Some of these technologies would include the airplane, the Zeppelin, the tank, poison gas, the submarine, and the machine gun. Even though the machine gun had been around for decades, it really came into its own in World War I. So how did technology affect how the war was fought? The biggest impact that this kind of technology had on World War I was that it greatly increased the number of casualties during the war. Up to maybe about 10 million soldiers were killed in World War I. 21 million were wounded in World War I. And so those are heavy, heavy casualties, and it's because of this new weapons technology. So describe the battle in the trenches in 5 descriptive words. What are some descriptive words that we might be able to think of? Well, it was deadly, it was dangerous, it was muddy, it was dirty, full of bacteria, wet, and also very boring too. Being in the trenches all day long, that was a very boring existence. So what was the Treaty of Versailles, and whom did it punish harshly, and how so? There's a lot that goes into that question, but we're going to try and give it a nice short answer. The Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that ended World War I, and the country that it punished was Germany. How so? It had a war guilt clause in it for the Germans to sign that said that they were 100% responsible for the war. Forget those underlying causes like Maine and the assassination. No, we're going to blame Germany 100% for the war and force them to sign an agreement that says that. It demanded $33 billion in war reparations to the Allies from Germany, and it caused tremendous resentment among the German people, not only against the Allies, but against their own government who signed off on this. So, what happened with Poland as a direct result of the Treaty of Versailles? That's a strange question, but Poland was one of numerous countries that was given independence from Russia or from Germany, and Poland was also given a corridor to the sea. In other words, it was given territory that gave it direct access to the Baltic, which was very useful for trade. They actually had a port city, Danzig, or in Polish, Gdansk. So what happened to the borders of Europe as a result of the Treaty of Versailles? New countries were formed, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up and made into 4 separate countries: Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. So what is the League of Nations? What was the League of Nations? And the League of Nations was a multi-member representative body of nations which was formed to settle disputes between countries to keep them from going to war. As a way to avoid war, they could take their disputes to the League of Nations and have their disputes settled there. So who wrote this 14 points, which is where the League of Nations came from, and what was it meant to accomplish? The 14 points, and we went into detail about this, was written by our president of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson. And his goal in writing the 14 points was to try to eliminate those underlying causes of World War I: the militarism, the alliance system, the imperialism, and the nationalism. Revolution and nationalism. So when you think revolution and you're talking about Unit 10, you're thinking the Russian Revolution. So what were 2 effects of World War I upon the Russian people? Well, millions died. A quarter of all casualties in World War I were Russian casualties. And another impact is that there were not 1 but 2 revolutions in Russia during World War I. And the one we are most familiar with is the one that we call the Russian Revolution that happened in October. Or you can kind of think of it like this: the Russian Revolution was really 2 revolutions. One happened in February of 1917, one happened in October of 1917. So describe some events that led up to the Russian Revolution. Well, some things that kind of happened that led up to it was, for one thing, Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, declared war on Germany in 1914. And World War I was a disaster for the Russians. Their army was ill-equipped and ill-trained. Nicholas II was a thoroughly incompetent leader. He was finally removed from power by that representative body in Russia called the Duma. He was replaced by a Russian provisional government which wanted to keep fighting the war. And a communist party called the Bolsheviks delivered another revolution, which they won, and they started calling themselves the Communist Party. They turned Russia into the first communist country. So maybe I just answered that question: who were the Bolsheviks? The word Bolshevik actually means majority, and they were a radical communist party. Who was their leader? Their leader was Vladimir Lenin, who became the eventual first communist leader of this country. As they campaigned for power in the Duma, they had a campaign slogan, and it's very simple. It was peace, bread, land. And so this says, explain what was meant by each. Okay, so peace meant, when you said peace to the Russian people as part of your campaign slogan, peace, that one word meant one thing: getting Russia out of the war, getting a peace agreement with Germany at any cost. Bread simply means having enough to eat. This war was causing mass starvation among people in Russia, especially after the Germans cut Russian railway lines and seriously hindered transportation as far as getting food from one place to another. and then land, giving the Russian people control over their agricultural destiny. The means of production in Russia, it's a very agricultural country. So what did the Bolsheviks reveal themselves to be once they took over? Once they took over, they revealed themselves to be communists, is what they really were. How did the Russian Revolution affect the outcome of World War I? Russia got out of the war, and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria, they might have won, except that the United States had joined just a short time later, and that tipped the balance in the favor of the Allies. But when Russia pulled out of the war, the Central Powers could very well have won the war. So what became the name of the new Russia after the Bolsheviks took over? They were still Russians, but they had a new name for their country, and that new name was, you could call it the Soviet Union, you could call it the USSR, you could call it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. With their new name, Russia became the first communist country. Fascism and Nazism in Europe can be classified by what type of government, and we're talking about a totalitarian government. And what was it about these words that a fascist would like? Germany, Germany, above everything in the world. And a fascist would like that because to a fascist, the state is more important than any other consideration. The most important thing in the world is the state, and it's particularly more important than individual rights. And you can see that reflected in this phrase. Now, the person who actually wrote this phrase was not thinking fascism, but it appeals to a fascist. Germany, Germany above everything in the world. It's not that Germany should be the most powerful nation. That's not what that means to a fascist. What that means to a fascist is that if you're a German, the German state should be the most important thing to you, more important than anything else. And so what type of government is characterized by the motto, hard work, sacrifice, and service to the nation? And again, that is going to be fascism. The nation is the most important thing. The state is the most important thing. It demands your hard work, your sacrifice, and your service. Why did Stalin and Hitler both organize purges of their own parties? What did they want to accomplish? They wanted to get rid of anyone who might oppose them. So purges were a way of getting rid of enemies or potential enemies. If you're even thinking about opposing Stalin, you were probably going to be purged and either killed or sent to a prison camp called a gulag way off in Siberia in the middle of nowhere where you couldn't influence anybody. Years of crisis and Great Depression. So what were the causes of the Great Depression in the United States? And we had a whole big lesson on that. We were talking about stock market speculation, overproduction of houses, cars, etc., and overproduction of food. Once they started overproducing and produced more than people could buy, it caused a huge slowdown in the economy. How did the United States respond or try to fix the Great Depression? Relief, reform, and recovery. We're talking about the New Deal under the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as FDR. And we saw a crash course video on all those various programs that were part of the New Deal. What were the causes of the Great Depression globally, particularly in Europe? We made all these loans to European countries under a plan called the Dawes Plan. We loaned money to Germany so that they could pay France and England, so that France and England could pay back the loans that we had also made to them, and it became kind of a vicious circle. And if any part of that circle broke down, which it did in the Great Depression, it was going to completely collapse. That was the Dawes Plan, Dawes, Dawes Plan, 1924. And I believe we talked about it somewhat, but you can also look that up. Why was the Soviet Union, the USSR, the former Russia, less affected by the Great Depression than other nations? And the reason for that is because they had a closed command economy. In a communist system, the government takes over the entire economy. The government runs everything, owns everything, determines the prices of everything, and determines how much of everything will be produced. So they were somewhat insulated by the Great Depression because of their various policies. What type of leaders rose to power during the Great Depression? Were they charismatic or what? Well, those types of leaders were what we call totalitarian dictators. And yes, they were very charismatic. And part of being a fascist and being a totalitarian leader is that you're at the head of a cult of personality. You demand absolute loyalty, not just to the state, not just to the country, but to you personally. And so that brings us to World War II. So what happened to Germany's borders after World War I? Germany had to give Alsace-Lorraine back to France, which they had taken from France back in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. Also, they had to give up a lot of territory to the newly reformed country of Poland, and they had to demilitarize the Rhine Valley that they had in the west between France and Germany. They weren't allowed to have any troops there at all because France felt like it threatened them. How did totalitarian dictators respond to opposition? They would totally crush opposition. Totalitarian dictators and fascists don't have a problem with violence. That's just part of what they do. Who was the British leader who said that they would never surrender in World War II? That was Winston Churchill. He got on the radio, promised that they would never, ever surrender to the Germans no matter what. That they would keep on fighting. They'd fight in the air, fight at sea, fight in the streets, fight in the countryside. He made it very clear we would not stop fighting. Then who was the military leader of Japan during World War II? And that was Hideki Tojo. He was a military dictator. The other dictators weren't necessarily military dictators, but he was. How did the Jewish people have to identify themselves during the rise of Hitler? And they had to wear a yellow star. That yellow star indicated that you were Jewish and that you were a possible target of all kinds of persecution, weren't you? And then what word was used for the genocide of Jewish people during World War II? So I'm going to go into a little detail on that one. The word Holocaust, the original term Holocaust is actually a Greek word. It's of Greek origin, and it was a religious term. It referred to a burnt sacrificial offering that you would make to God in ceremonial worship. And over the centuries, that word has been used to refer to huge massacres of people or to calamities that involved large numbers of deaths. But the mass killing of 12 million Jews and other undesirables by the Nazis during World War II, that event has special recognition as the Holocaust. There have been many other Holocausts, but that's the Holocaust because that's far and away the biggest. Some terms to know. The first one is imperialism. Imperialism is the process of exerting control over another country by military or economic force. Militarism. Militarism is when military values and military culture takes over a nation and military goals as well. Nationalism, we went into that quite a bit, various levels of nationalism, but essentially it is the belief that each ethnic group should have its own nation. There are layers that you can put on top of that. For example, your nation first, your nation right or wrong, your nation to the exclusion of other nations, the narrative that your nation is superior and that your nation has been victimized by inferiors. So you can take nationalism really far into some very dark and dangerous areas. The alliance system is when countries form large alliances to counterbalance each other. So those are your four underlying causes that have been identified as being causes of World War I. Then you also have totalitarianism, and that's when a dictator controls literally every aspect of the government and of the people's very lives. People to know: Woodrow Wilson. He was the U.S. president during World War I and during the Treaty of Versailles. He came up with the 14 points. He came up with, and the 14 points had the League of Nations in it. He could not persuade his own country, however, to join that League of Nations or to sign that treaty. Tsar Nicholas II. He was the czar. He was Russian. He was very incompetent. He was overthrown, and then and his entire family were assassinated by the Bolsheviks. Benito Mussolini. He was a totalitarian dictator. He was from Italy. He inspired Hitler when Italy was defeated in World War II. He tried to get to Switzerland, and he was killed by Italian partisan fighters. Hideki Tojo, he was the military dictator of the Japanese Empire. Joseph Stalin, he was the totalitarian dictator of Russia. He was a communist. He's known for things like the Great Purge, his 5-year plans, collectivization of farms, and for gulags. And he was also the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as FDR, he was the president during the Great Depression and during World War II of the United States. He's known for the New Deal, and he's known for getting the war won. And then finally, Winston Churchill. He's the Prime Minister of Britain. He led the country during World War II as well. He got the country through the Battle of Britain, also known as the Blitz if you're looking at it from the German perspective. So that is it. That is our review. I hope it comes in handy. I hope it gets you a good score, and we'll see you then.